Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 8 of the ongoing series, Shank's Children's Lit Zoom show. Today, I have a few things I want to do. I want to introduce fantasy as our next major genre that we are covering, and our first since the midterm. And I have some notes I'm going to give you. It's under the file Fantasy Notes in Canvas. So you'll see these notes in Canvas, and you can look at them at your own pace or whatever. But I'll go over that today because there is an assignment that's going to be due by midnight Wednesday dealing with fantasy. And actually the first work of fantasy that I'm going to ask you to read this week, which would be Charlotte's Web, which is a classic, wonderful example of what we would call light fantasy, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then next week, our second example of fantasy I'm going to ask you to read is another classic, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which we will call an example of high fantasy, which means that to really enjoy the book, you have to be high. No, that's not what it means. It was just a joke. Sometimes I just throw these things out just for my own amusement, and hopefully if you laugh, fine. If you don't, I don't know. I'll never know if you laugh or not. You're probably just shaking your head. But anyway, I do want to introduce and talk about fantasy, and I also want to explain the assignment that's due later this week with Charlotte's Web as an example of fantasy. So I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about and review your answers to the folktale assignment that you did for Thursday. And I looked over the weekend. And again, I compiled all your answers, and you guys did you did a really wonderful job of this. And since we didn't cover this before the midterm, I didn't really put a midterm question, or I didn't really have a midterm question on folk tales, because I figured this assignment would give you plenty of practice in experiencing a couple of folk tales and analyzing them. And so since we didn't talk about that before the midterm, I didn't put a folktale question on the midterm, but we'll kind of touch on that and review that as we wrap up folk tales, fairy tales, and myths, that section, and we'll move on. A lot of you did some really nice analysis. I hope you enjoyed watching the YouTube versions of these folk tales. I thought this would be a little bit different way to experience our material as opposed to reading them. And as I teased some of you in the emails that I sent back with the grade, I'm always interested in how people come up with rhymes to remember, the 2-line rhyme. And it's not easy to do, is it? And we had varying degrees of success with this, so I might have a little fun with that today. Just tease you a little bit. They aren't easy to do. And I'm glad I make you do that and not have to do it myself, because I'd probably be just as awful as, well, not awful, I shouldn't say that. Some of them were pretty good. Some of them were just okay. All right, so I do want to talk about folk tales and that assignment, wrap that up a little bit. And I do want to go over the midterm today. Oh, and by the way, let me throw out a number here. 66. 66 is your first number. All right, so I'm actually recording this on Sunday afternoon. The midterms aren't due until tonight at midnight, so I have not had a chance, obviously, to read any of these or grade any of these. But like I said, they're all due by midnight. I'm not accepting any late answers. So I thought what I'd do, I'm going to post this video on Monday as usual. So I'll go over the potential answers to each of the questions. And then obviously I'll start grading the exams on Monday, which will be today as you're watching it. And so hopefully by going over the answers that I was looking for, you'll have a pretty good idea of what I was looking for. And hopefully you were able to answer the questions along the same lines. And when I send back by email the results of your midterm exam, if you have any questions about why I took some points off for whatever question or whatever individually, then please, send me an email if you have any questions about that. But hopefully by going over the answers that I was looking for today, you'll have a pretty good idea of why maybe you missed a few points here and there, if that's the case. Okay. Also, as I mentioned last week, when I start grading these and I start sending back the midterm exam grades, I'll also include in the email where you stand grade-wise in the course, as we are now at really the official midterm point of the class. This is the eighth session. We have 8 more to go. We're 4 weeks in, and we still have about 4 weeks to go. So it goes pretty quick. It has gone pretty quick. And thanks for sticking with me. So I will be receiving and grading the midterm starting Monday today. And hopefully in the next day or two, you will get your results back for not only your midterm exam, but also where you stand course-wise. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to email me about that as well. So I want to talk about fantasy. I want to talk about folk tales. And then I also want to talk about the midterm. So that's what's on tap for today. Did I give you a number? Oh, yeah, I did. I already gave you one. 66 was the first number. Let's give you a second number even before I go any further. 78. 78 is your second number. Okay. All right. First, let me explain the homework, and it ties in with fantasy and Charlotte's Web. And again, of course, this is in Canvas, that top file, just as usual. So this is class 8. Here are the assignments due by midnight Wednesday, July 5th. Now I realize that, we're in the middle of a holiday week. We have July 4th on Tuesday, but I have to kind of keep going. And I would say that if there is absolutely no way you can possibly get your assignment done by midnight July 5th and you have a really good reason, you might email me. I might give you an extension because I realize we have a holiday Tuesday. But I really think you can get this done, and you'll have today and Wednesday, even if Tuesday is a lost cause because you have celebrations or whatever. So here are the assignments due by midnight on Wednesday. Obviously watch this lecture as usual and take note of the numbers in the sequence. So you'll include that in your homework. I'm going to ask you to read, as I mentioned, Charlotte's Web, which is our first of 2 examples of fantasy. It's a quick read. I'm going to ask you to read all of it. It shouldn't take you that long. And I imagine many of you are probably already familiar with the story, maybe read it when you were kids. One of my memories of grade school, I remember my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Hughes, who was one of my all-time favorite teachers. Each afternoon, if we were good, at the end of the school day, she would read us a chapter or 2 from Charlotte's Web. And I don't know why I remember that, but I do. Teachers affect eternity. They never know where their influence ends. It's one of my favorite quotes. And she was a big influence on me. I really love Mrs. Hughes. So please read all of the book. Also, there are some corresponding pages in the packet in Canvas that I'd like you to read, 149 to 157 and 161 to 164. And you'll need to read those because one of the questions or a couple of questions deal with the information that you will read about that. So, and then here is the quiz that you'll do on your own and turn in by midnight on Wednesday, and it has to do with Charlotte's Web. And let me go to that one. I call it the Charlotte's Web worksheet. And again, this will be worth 30 points. And it's probably a good idea, instead of reading the book and then doing this, you might kind of keep this in mind as you're reading, and as you come up with it, as you see examples of each of these, you can kind of fill in the gaps as you're reading. One of the reasons I love this book, and I think one of the reasons why it's remained a classic after all these years, is that I think it really works on a lot of different levels. E.B. White was really masterful in this deceptively simple little story, little fantasy for children. Um, and not only effective and interesting and entertaining for children, but I think there's some things in there for adults as well. I think he satirizes our society in some ways, and I won't talk about that today, maybe talk a little bit more about it on Thursday. But there's a lot of different things that he does in this book that I think really make it so effective, and it really checks off a lot of the boxes of criteria for judging children's literature. So these are the kinds of things I'm going to ask you to look for as you are reading. And then, as it says here, note at least 2 examples of each one of these. So I'll just go through this real quick to explain what I'm looking for. One of the things we see in the narration is, and this is usually from Charlotte, because she's a very wise spider, she introduces a lot of challenging words. I guess we would call them vocabulary words if we were teaching. These are words that kids of the age that are reading this book might not know the meaning of these words, and they are introduced, and in most cases they are defined as well. Charlotte not only brings up the word, but also defines it. So among other things, among other criteria for great children's literature, it does broaden our vocabulary, literally speaking. There's any number of, I guess we'll call them big words, that are introduced in the story and defined for the child reader. So it helps broaden their vocabulary. I can imagine so many teachers who teach this book probably have a list of vocabulary words that they ask the students to look out for. And I guess I'm kind of asking you to do the same thing. So give me at least 2 challenging vocabulary words that are kind of put into the narrative, that these are words that children probably didn't know before they read the book, but now they do. Another great thing about the book is that it's very educational, particularly about farm life and about nature and about animals. And if you're a city kid like me and you were reading this book when you were a little kid, you learn a lot about what it's like to live on the farm, educational information. So any number of bits of interesting information are dropped into the story through the course of the narrative. So be on the lookout for those, and quote for me 2 of those examples of that. Another great thing, I love the descriptions in this book. White does a great job of using the different senses as he's describing these places. There's basically 2 main settings in the story. One is the farm, and then one is the county fair. And in both cases, we have scenes where not only what can be seen is described, but again, and don't rely on sight senses. Pick out, and again, you can find these as you're reading, times when perhaps sounds are described, or smells very vividly are described, or maybe what something tastes like or what something feels like. So a lot of great sensory details in the story. 4 and 5 kind of go together. This is just one in a million examples of works for children where the main characters are animals and not real people. But I think that Wilbur is kind of the stand-in for a child in the story. Wilbur is very, well, it depends on how you feel about Wilbur. He can be pretty annoying, but you could say he has a lot of childlike qualities to him. Or if you're kind of annoyed with him, you could say he has a lot of childish qualities to him. But I think he represents children. So he's a pig, but I think he represents children. So give me two examples in the story that show that he kind of represents the children in all of us, as the phrase goes. All right, then number 5 is similar. Are there other things in the story that represent or symbolize something other than just what they appear to be? And you could apply that to characters or the setting. I think you could make the case that Charlotte is a very symbolic character. She's a spider, but she's more than a spider. I think she represents other things too. So you might ask yourself, if Wilbur represents the child in the story, who or what is Charlotte representing? So what are some other examples? Give me at least 2 other symbols or symbolic actions or characters that you find in the story. Number 6 has to do with themes. I love this about the book as well. It's not just a cute little story about talking animals. I think it's about something. I think it has messages and lessons that can be learned, that children can learn from reading about the story. So what are at least 2 lessons about life, and I would call them themes, that are also dropped in the narrative? Number 7, we always talk about this. What would be the best age and grade for this book? And explain your answer. And I mentioned that our teacher in 4th grade read this, and I thought that was a pretty good age and grade, but you don't have to agree with me. You might go younger or older, but answer that question. We always talk about age appropriateness. And then finally, this has to do with what I'm going to get to in just a minute. There's certain things we look for, and there's certain things that we judge fantasy on, and there's certain things we list as criteria for what makes good fantasy. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about, it almost seems ironic or almost like an oxymoron, but one of the things we look for in good fantasy is how believable is it? Or how believable is it? Or realistic is it within the confines of the story? Any fantasy, in the back of your mind, you're saying to yourself, well, this could never happen. Animals don't talk, and spiders don't spin words in their webs. They're not capable of doing that. So you kind of have to suspend your disbelief and buy into the premise. And one of the things you look for in fantasy is how effectively does the creator of the work, whether it's the author or the screenwriter or whoever, how effectively do they create this fantastical universe in such a way that even though we know it's a fantasy, it's easy for us to buy into it, as opposed to thinking, well, there's a lot of inconsistencies in this fantasy, so it's hard for me to suspend my disbelief because the author hasn't done a good enough job of convincing me that this is real. Or, I shut my brain off for the 2 hours I'm watching this movie, and I forget that none of this stuff could ever happen. But it's easy for me to buy into it because the creator has done such an effective job of establishing that. So I'm going to go over the techniques in the fantasy notes in just a second. So that's what I mean by number 8. How does White in this book use the technique? And it says the BB file. I'm sorry about that. It should be Canvas file. I forgot to change that. How does White use the techniques listed in the Canvas file to help make the fantasy believable, even though we know that's absurd to believe in all this stuff that's happening in the story? So those are the 8 questions I want you to answer. Give me 2 examples that show each one of those, and that will be your homework by Wednesday at midnight. Okay? I think I'll give you another number now. How about number 80? 80 is our 3rd number. All right, so to help you do the homework, let me go over the fantasy notes file. And In a minute, I'm going to touch on how to make fantasy believable. That's what you see to your right. That's what I was referring to a second ago. Um, Fantasy for kids uh, does a lot of different kinds of things. This maybe is their first opportunity to explore other realities other than the ones they live in and to use their imagination. So many of these stories, particularly the ones for kids, we're going to get, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a little bit darker. And of course, there are a lot of dark fantasies for adults now, but we're kind of dealing with the ones for kids. And so many of them just kind of start with the idea, what if, animals could talk? What if you walked into a wardrobe and you came out the other end in a magical place called Narnia? What if, we could travel back and forth in time? What if, we could change shapes, or we could, you know, whatever, and then take the premise and go with it. So many of these stories, begin with that very intriguing and fun question. Um, Another benefit of fantasy, and this kind of hints at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and more mature fantasies, but a lot of times fantasies are a way, and this is kind of like what we were talking about with dystopian fiction. Dystopian authors create this world that's really a commentary on this world. Well, in a sense, fantasy does that as well, or at least some fantasies do, and maybe not all of them. A lot of light fantasies don't get into deep issues, but some of the more serious high fantasy stories would. So in some cases, and I think we see a little bit of this, as I mentioned before, I think we see a little bit of this in Charlotte's Web. White is very clever. So there's some things in the story for adults to learn from as well as kids. There's two ways of classifying fantasy, and I'll start with the second one first. Light fantasy is maybe geared for the younger children. It's less serious, usually a one-dimensional fantasy. And again, some good examples of this would be Charlotte's Web, James and the Giant Peach, which I used to teach in this class. I don't know if anybody's read that. That's a wonderful book. That's a wonderful example of light fantasy. And then you graduate as you get a little bit older to what we would call high fantasy, which is more serious. So basically, these two categories are kind of based on the seriousness of the kind of questions they raise and how they're answered. And now we're getting into things like the Narnia series, which we're going to read the first book. Certainly Harry Potter would be an example of high fantasy, Lord of the Rings even more so. So you get the idea. Light fantasy could be something as simple as a farm filled with animals who can talk. And that's the basic one-dimensional fantasy that we have. Whereas we get into something like Harry Potter or the Narnia series, Lord of the Rings, etc. A little bit deeper, maybe darker, a little bit more serious, more violent. The themes are perhaps a little bit more subtle and important, maybe than, or less obvious than, say, light fantasy. But those are the basic two categories. So, one of the things I might ask our presenters in the fantasy group when they're choosing a work of fantasy to write about, one of the first things they might comment on is they would say, well, I think X, the book I'm writing about or the movie I'm writing about, would fall under more of a light fantasy than high, or vice versa. That might be one initial way, introductory way to identify what kind of fantasy we're dealing with. And then you could go on from there. So it's one of the things you might want to bring up or talk about. What is the goal and purpose of fantasy for child readers? Well, there's a couple of different answers to this. And one of them you'll read about in your packet article. I took this from Pierce. Fantasy appeals to the child's need for hope, optimism, possibility, inspiration, use their imagination. A lot of times in fantasy, we have things like equality and justice and idealism that maybe doesn't quite exist yet in our world, unfortunately, but does exist in this fantasy world. And this is the kind of world we should perhaps shoot for or emulate or try to eventually reach the part or the point where we could maybe live the fantasy that is only a fantasy right now. It's not our reality. The Cooper article, which you'll read, is, answers the point about that Pierce makes, which one of the goals of fantasy is that it serves as an escape, for kids, particularly as they get a little bit older. I talk about this in Lit for Young Adults. The two most popular genres for young adults is fantasy and realistic fiction. And those would seem to be the two most different genres that you can pick from. But it makes sense. Once you get a little bit older, and I guess this would apply to the older end of our spectrum, once you get into sixth, seventh grade, life gets a little bit more complicated, and, maybe school isn't quite as much fun as it used to be, or maybe, you're getting picked on, or maybe you're moving around from one place to another, or maybe you don't have any friends, or maybe you're starting to have issues with your parents. And then you come home after kind of a rough day at school, and you pick up a fantasy book and you escape for a few hours. And it helps you get away from your problems. And that we should never downplay that as a result or a purpose. That's a great reason for a book to exist, to help a child escape for a while their problems. Or the other popular genre, which we'll eventually talk about in children's lit, is realistic. They either love fantasy, which helps them escape, or they love realistic fiction, where they can read about other kids in stories that are going through the same kind of crap they're going through, and it makes them, feel better about themselves, or they can at least say to themselves, I'm not the only one. Other people know what this is like. I don't feel so bad, because in this character, I see what I'm going through. But Cooper says, well, it's not just an escape, but it's a way for them to draw themselves into who they are and what life is all about, and start to think about their relationship to the world they live in, because they're reading about a fantastical world. All right, so a couple of different perspectives on what fantasy does for children who are reading it. Another thing I would bring up real quick is the distinction between fantasy and science fiction. There is a difference. They share a lot of the same qualities and characteristics. I guess I would say the main difference between the two is that, science fiction is usually, if not always, based in some kind of science. Whereas fantasy, just could never, ever happen. Whereas in science fiction, there is a possibility that perhaps it makes sense scientifically, at least, or there is the science that would back up a lot of what's being described. My example of this would be, 150 years ago, we didn't have submarines and we didn't have rocket ships that went to the moon, but we had writers writing about those things. And a lot of the things they envisioned, with a little bit of research, they realized, if we just had the means to do this, it is possible scientifically. And of course, with, advancements in technology and so on, we eventually did have submarines, and we eventually did have rockets that went to the moon. So it wasn't totally outside the realm of possibility that one day those things could happen. Okay. We used to have characters. I think Dick Tracy was a comic book character from like 80 years ago, and he had a watch where he could see and talk to the people he was talking to, and it was like, oh my God, isn't that amazing? So they knew back then that this could be possible. We don't have this happening now, but it could be possible. And of course, today everybody has a cell phone. Everybody has that. So that's the difference. Fantasy is just, there's no way we could possibly do this ever, but it's not within any kind of realm of reality. Whereas science fiction, It could happen. All right. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the things we look for in judging a work of fantasy is how believable is it within the setup of the story. All right. And again, it sounds like an oxymoron, but it ends up being the thing that either sucks you in and makes you suspend your disbelief, or it's something that you say, there are just too many unrealistic, it seems funny to say this, but you say, there are just too many unrealistic things in this fantasy for me to even buy the fantasy for the 2 hours I'm watching the movie. All right, so we look for how believable is the setting, how believable is the plot, how believable are the characters, even if they're like talking animals. And if you'll notice in Charlotte's Web, each of the groups of animals kind of have their own personality. So he went so far as to do that. And it is important. I ask, why is this important? Because otherwise you don't buy it and you stop watching or you stop reading. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience of watching or reading a fantasy where after a while you said, I can't buy this because there are too many inconsistencies even within the fantasy story. All right, so I found a few years ago a great article by Shapiro, which kind of went through the different things that creators can do to help make their fantasy story, which is totally unrealistic and totally unbelievable on the surface, still make it believable enough that we can buy it and stick with it. And this is the kind of thing I want you to look for, well, both in Charlotte's Web, and this is one of the questions that I'm asking you to do. That's question number 8. And then also we're going to see the same thing in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So notice what the author can do. First of all, ground the story first in reality before moving into fantasy. So you may notice in a lot of fantasy works, it doesn't start with a fantastical world. It starts with a very familiar, realistic setting, and then eventually transports us into the fantasy world. So it grounds us first in something recognizable. And again, I think it's particularly important for kids. And then we're transformed into the fantasy world. So we kind of move from the primary world, the realistic world, the one we're familiar with, and then eventually something happens that will take us into the secondary world. So how does White do that, for example? I won't answer that question. That could be part of your answer to the homework question. Another trick, well, trick may not be the right word, but another thing you might see in one of these stories is to have, at least in the beginning, some character in the story who doesn't buy it, who doesn't believe it, who is a disbeliever, who says, this is ridiculous, that could never happen. He's the doubting Thomas, if you want to use a cliche that goes back to mythology. So while the narrator believes the fantasy, or maybe the main character does, there's at least one character in the beginning who says, I don't buy this. This is ridiculous. And then what happens is, at some point in the story, the doubter, becomes a believer. And it's like, well, if this guy or this person buys into it, then there must be something to it. So when they are finally convinced the fantastical events are actually happening, then it makes it easier for the reader who may have had their own doubts to do the same thing. And look for that. I don't know if we see that necessarily in Charlotte's Web, but we certainly see it in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Another thing to look out for is sometimes in these stories, you'll have an authority figure, some wise person who knows everything. And you would expect them to say, oh, this fantasy is ridiculous. But no, the authority figure buys it, or at least says it's possible, or at least validates it. So you look at somebody who apparently knows what they're doing and is knowledgeable and wise. And if they say, well, yeah, it could happen, or I kind of buy that, then that might be That makes the reader, it makes it easier for the reader then to also buy it. So you have the doubter who becomes a believer, that helps you buy into it. And then if you have this wise person who you look for wisdom, and if they buy into it, well, okay. And you'll see that in both Charlotte's Web and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So look out for that. Number 4, well, one of the questions I'm asking you about Charlotte's Web is how White so vividly describes the things in the story using the different senses. So the details of the setting are critical. So even though you're describing a place that doesn't exist, you do so in such vivid detail using the different senses that, I mean, we feel like we're there, even though, again, the rational part of our brain in the back of our head is saying, well, this could never happen. But oh my God, I can smell it, I can taste it, I can hear those sounds, and it becomes real to me, even if I know in the back of my head it's not real. And again, White is great at this. And we'll see this also in Wardrobe as well. So the details, the imagery, so crucial. Also, we're dealing with characters and situations and settings that don't exist, but they all have their own backstory and their own origin. So are the characters described vividly? And do you understand where they come from? And do they all speak the same way, or do they come from different places? So make the language, dialogue, dialect consistent for each character or group represented. All right, that helps you buy into the story. And again, I think we see this in Charlotte's Web. If you'll notice, each of the different groups of animals on the farm, each kind of have their own personality and their way of speaking. Well, I just gave you another one. I should stop giving you all the answers. And then finally, the author should try to be as consistent as possible within the fantasy that they've created. Because if there are any inconsistencies, and by the way, I think there are a few in Charlotte's Web that I will point out, and maybe we'll talk about on Thursday. I don't want to spoil it for you. I think he does, by and large, a pretty good job of creating this situation that we can believe and buy into, but there are a couple of things that are a little bit inconsistent. I'm not saying that over time, and certainly over the period of, say, a series of books, you can't have characters change their attitudes about things or their actions or their personalities or whatever, but at least those things should be properly motivated. Those changes should be motivated. And my favorite story about this, I don't know what you feel about J.K. Rowling now, but I imagine there's still a lot of Harry Potter fans in the class. There's a story, and I've read it more than once, so it must be true, that for the last book in the series, she actually hired a fact checker to go through and read the final book and then make sure that everything was consistent with what she had created in the previous books. Because even she couldn't keep everything straight in her own head. So I love that idea, the idea that I need somebody to make sure that the stuff that I have in this last book, is consistent with the stuff I've established in the earlier books, because even I can't keep it all straight. And she must have known too that, Potter fans are notorious nerds for this. So if they found anything that wasn't quite right or wasn't consistent with what she had established in the second book, and now here in the 7th book, something different, she must have known that they would call her on this. So it's a challenge. I mean, if you're writing something of fantasy, you still have to kind of work within a framework that you've established that is consistent. Because if it's not consistent, then the fantasy sort of falls apart. So those are the things I'm asking you to look for in that last question. In the case of Charlotte's Web, how does White does he do any of these things? And you can pick out at least 2 to share with us in that question. But I think he does just about all of this. So where do we see this in Charlotte's Web? All right, so those are the notes on fantasy I have for you. Let's do another number. 83. 83. All right. As I mentioned, I would like to just spend a few minutes reviewing your answers to the folktale assignment. So let me get that up. And I hope you found this assignment interesting. One of the general criteria for children's lit is to allow the child to experience other cultures and other time periods, uh, to live cathartically through the story, to expose them to other religions, other ways of doing things. Also, I love folktales. So many of these deal with origin stories, and every culture kind of has its own explanation for why this is like this or how this came to be. And some of the stories, again, we don't believe them, or maybe we do, I don't know. But they're kind of fun. And in many cases, as you guys pointed out, and I'm not going to read all of your answers, but you can peruse these on your own. A lot of them have messages and morals. They don't maybe flat out say so. A couple of them do. It's not like Aesop's fables, though, where they say, and the moral of the story is, just in case you didn't get it. But a lot of them, are fun stories. Perhaps they're origin stories that we don't really believe, but still they're entertaining, and they often come with a message or a moral that is timeless. So even though a lot of these stories go back a long, long time, they still have relevance to kids today. And I noticed, we have stories from Vietnam, we have African stories, we have Asian stories, we had a couple of American stories mentioned. The Man Who Never Lied, I noticed was mentioned a couple times. The Starfruit Tree was mentioned a couple times. And again, I don't want to pick on people's rhyme to remember, but I just think this is fun. If you are full of greed, you will never succeed. That's not bad. That's pretty good for the Starfruit Tree. The Magic Apple came from the Middle East. Man Who Never Lied came from Africa. The Hunter comes from Nigeria. John Henry, of course, is a well-known American folktale. By the way, I wish they would make these into DVDs. Last I checked, they were still on VHS, but there was a whole series of adaptations, animated adaptations of folk tales and fairy tales. They were called Rabbit Ears Productions, and I recommend you check these out. You can probably find the VHSs in local libraries. I think they were made mostly in the 80s and 90s, but they are illustrated folk tales and fairy tales, usually narrated by somebody very prominent. And there's a great John Henry. What made me think of it is John Henry is a great one, narrated by the great Denzel Washington, with music by the late great B.B. King. And there's one or two that are narrated by the late great, sadly missed Robin Williams narrates a couple of them. So Rabbit Ears Productions. If you're a teacher, I can't recommend those highly enough. You can probably find them on YouTube. So you don't have to get a VHS. My God, nobody has a VHS player anymore. But I always wonder why I haven't seen them on DVDs yet. There must be a copyright issue or something. The Fox and the Crane is an Aesop's fable. There's The Man Who Never Lied again. Cuckoo comes from Mexico. And again, notice, all of them had a message. All of them have a theme, something the child can learn from. The First Nation legend of how North America came to be. So a lot of these are origin stories. Here's a pretty good, I like this one. This was a pretty classy rhyme to remember. Gems are pretty and rare, but don't always provide. Careful, greed and death share the same coin side. Now That's pretty good. The Goat Who Ate Tigers was from India. A couple people did The Fairy Who Cried Gems from India. Stone Soup from Hungary. A stone is not just a rock on its own. Instead, it is a stone that could feed a whole home. Star fruit tree, again mentioned, from Vietnam. How Tiger Got His Stripes. Again, another origin story. So if a kid ever wondered, yeah, how did the tiger get his stripes? This is a cute little story that talks about it. But there are themes here. A potential theme is to avoid being too prideful, as it could blind you, much like the tiger's pride blinded him until it was too late. So, there's a message there. There's a moral there as well. Why the Sky is Far Away, another origin story. Over 500 years old. Like I said, some of these go way, way back. Again, how North America came to be. The magic pot from Asia, China. If you wish you had what your neighbors got, walk a mile in your own shoes and hope you find a magic pot. Why koala has a stumpy tail from Australia. So check these out. There's a wide variety of them from different areas. And it seemed like most of you enjoyed watching the animated version of these books. Some of you had some interesting criticisms of them. And again, particularly note the messages. So it's telling a story, maybe explaining something along the way, but I think the messages, the moral of the story, that's kind of why I wanted you to do the rhyme for the rhyme to remember, because that kind of focuses on, if I had to sum up this story, what's the story about, or what's the story teaching? That's what the rhyme was all about. So I thank you for those. And again, if you're interested in checking out a couple other videos other than the two that you did, and again, if we were in a classroom situation, we'd talk more about this, and I'd be curious I'd probably ask students about, well, what made you pick these two? Because there was a big, long list I gave you, so all you had to go by was the title. And then I think I also included, where the story came from. So I would have been curious to know, why did you, for example, why did the student pick Stone Soup and the star fruit tree out of all the other ones? I would have been interested to know that. Maybe I should have made that one of the questions. Why did you pick this? But I didn't do that. But it would have been interesting to talk about. All right, so thank you for that. Those were very, very good. All right, the last thing I wanted to do today is go over the midterm exam and basically what was expected. And I actually wrote down the basic answers here if I can find them. Hold on a second. Okay, so real quick, and again, if you have any questions after I give you back your score on your midterm about individual questions or whatever, feel free to ask me this week, after you get the results back. But the first question was, how are any 4 mythological archetypes found in the Hunger Games? And of course, we spent quite a bit of time on that. You did a quiz on this, and there's so many to choose from. And I just listed a few from the hero myth, from Campbell and Seeger. And then I gave you a list of qualities of the hero myth. And so there's so many. We have monsters, the mentor, the journey, Loyal band of companions, the quest, the task, the fall, the underworld. So many different character archetypes, including the mentor and the shadow and the damsel in distress. And I mean, there's 1,000 of them. I think most people will probably do really well on that question. Number two, besides language and violence, which I thought anybody could come up with, whether they've taken the class or not, what are 3 other reasons why books are banned or challenged? And I've listed them here, besides language and violence. And then I also ask you, could there ever be a justification for banning a book for children to read? Explain a yes or no answer. And I'm kind of interested in just how you support your answer. It's not like there's a right or wrong answer to that. It's kind of an opinion question, but I wanted you to answer it. I wanted you to support your answer. So that's what I was grading you on that. I kind of made my preference known. About the only reason I could think of for banning or censoring a book for kids is age appropriateness. I don't know. But that's just me. You might have different opinions on that. All right, question 3. I asked you to pick one of the works that was presented by students so far this semester. And there were 4 that were done in the picture book group. And then there were 3 that were done in the folktale, fairy tale, myth group. And all of them I thought were quite good. So basically, I asked you, choose one of the books given in the student presentations, explain how it meets any 3 of the criteria or characteristics for the given genre it belongs. So if you picked one of the picture books, you needed to explain how it met any 3 criteria that we look for picture books. And if it was a book from the myth, folktale, fairy tale group, do the same thing, only how does it meet any criteria or characteristics of a fairy tale, myth, or folktale? And of course, if you were one of the 7 presenters who have gone so far, you couldn't pick your own to write about, because I figure you're an expert on that one. So that's what that question was all about. Question 4, what are any 3 characteristics, conventions, or motifs of classic fairy tales? And I've listed, some of the characteristics and motifs right there. There was a big long list that I went over in that lecture. And then, how are each of these motifs evident in one of the fairy tales in the Golden Book collection? So I wanted you to pick one of the tales from the collection, other than Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast. And I even told you in my preview last week, I said, I'm not going to ask you about Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast, because those are so well known that you could answer that even if you hadn't read the Golden Book collection. So I wanted you to pick another story from one of the other ones in that collection and show how it had any 3 of these characteristics or motifs. So hopefully you were able to do that. There were a couple of articles dealing with what Disney does to fairy tales. The article, Disney Damages Fairy Tales and Historical Folklore. I asked, how are 3 ways Disney does this, according to Jones and Zipes? Those were the people who were quoted in those articles. And here were the main points they made. The stories are stripped of their meaning. For example, Puss in Boots becomes a young king, so they're changed. A lot of the stories are kind of autobiographical to Disney himself. Many of them are dated in the fact that they're patriarchal and perpetuate a male myth, so that's mentioned. They rob the tales of its voice and changes its form and meaning and moral. The whole idea that the prince saving the princess and the princess needing a savior is a Disney idea that's applied to these stories. And basically, another point that's made in that article is Disney rewrites them to mean what he wants them to mean for his own pleasure and gain. So those are the particular points that were made in that article. So that's what I'm looking for. I mean, you could answer that question generally and never have read the article. But what I'm looking for is, did you read the article, and can you quote from the article? I asked you to, when I said look over these articles, I said review them and be able to, summarize, 3 of the main points in each article. So that's kind of what I asked you to do for that article. Question 6 was basically listing. It said list any 3 styles of art in picture books and also list any 3 elements of art. And I have all of them listed there, the different styles and the different elements. So all you had to do there was pick 3 of each and get them correct. Then 7, we've been basing our entire course on this. It's the first thing I go over in the semester is what are some of the, well, it says list any 4 personal values that children can derive from reading and literature as presented in our packet and in our Canvas. And here again are the basic values that we look for. And I just asked you to come up with 4 of those. So I have a feeling most people will do pretty well on that. And then question 8, you had your choice of 2 articles to talk about. First one was explain how the article shows any 3 of, quote, the 5 lessons in human goodness in the Hunger Games. So there are 5 of them. I ask you to come up with 3, and there are the 5 right there. Or the second one was give 3 reasons Tahir gives that Katniss Everdeen is my hero. And Tahir liked Katniss because she's powerful, courageous, capable of great rage, is not to be underestimated. And he makes the point that, you know, this makes her empathetic to a lot of adolescent readers, particularly because a lot of teenage girls are like this. He said it, not me. Another couple of qualities that make her Tahir's hero: she's able to adapt, she's not particularly perfect or nice, and she's not always heroic in a world that is ugly. And she's haunted by the killing she does. So those are the specific things that Tahir had to say. Now, I mean, if you came up with general reasons why, you know, Katniss Everdeen is a great hero, but it told me that you really didn't read the article, then I would take off points for that. I mean, this is what I wanted you to, I wanted you to read the article, get somebody else's perspective. I didn't ask you why you think Katniss Everdeen is a hero. I wanted you to know what this critic had to say. So I was testing you on that. So hopefully you were able to give me specific answers that came specifically from the articles that I asked you to review. So, and again, I do give partial credit on questions. So if I ask you, you know, name 3 things, whatever, and you only came up with 2, I would still give you some credit for that. I wouldn't take off all the points. So that's how I grade. These will start coming in. Well, you're watching the video today, Monday. I'm actually recording it on Sunday, but I'll start getting these on Monday. And as I said, I'll start grading them. And sometime in the next day or 2, hopefully I'll have those graded and sent to you, along with a grade on where you stand course-wise so far this semester. That would include, obviously, the midterm, which is where 20% of your grade. It would include the scores you've gotten on the various quizzes so far. And again, 7 of you have done your presentation already. The rest of you still need to do your written presentation, so that's worth 100 quiz points. Haven't done the author profiles yet, although that is coming up next week, and I'll talk a little bit more about that probably on Thursday. So also on Thursday, I am going to talk about the final paper, which will be due at the very end of the semester. But I wanted to kind of introduce it so you can start thinking about it, because again, in summer, we go pretty fast. We're talking about just 4 weeks away. So I do want to talk about that on Thursday too. I'm glad I remembered that. Let me throw one last number at you, 91. 91. So we have 5 numbers today. All right. As always, if you have any questions or issues, let me know. If not, then I will see you again on Thursday, and we'll talk more about Charlotte's Web and kind of wrap that up as well. All right. Have a great, well, I'm doing this on Sunday. Hope you're doing well on the exam. Many of you are probably taking the exam as I speak. So we'll see you on Thursday. Have a great couple days. Thank you.